The Errant Apprentice, Book 1, Ghile by Kevin Hayman. Chapter 3. Thunder. It took what seemed like ages for Terry to fall asleep. His mind kept replaying the fight with the dragon and then the story his uncle had told him. When sleep finally came, it was full of dreams of the same. The talk, the dragon. But this time there was something different. As he approached the dragon in his dream, a face formed in the leaves behind it. Or, more accurately, the leaves sort of realigned themselves into a face. The shadows fell in just the right way for pareidolia to kick in and tell him that what he saw in the trees behind the dragon was humanoid. Terry suddenly realized that, again, this was a dream. The shadows moved. The face spoke. "Do you feel whole?" Terry stared at it. "What?" he asked. "Do you," it repeated, "feel whole? After your battle? After learning the truth?" Terry stopped his advance on the dragon. The monster continued its activities with the tractor, which Terry found annoying for a dream of the face. He thought for a time before answering. "Should I?" "Child, you've been seeking something your whole life. Were these things that something?" "No," he said. "No, I don't feel whole. I don't even know what that really means. All I know is that there's more for me to do than this, and I can't do it here." The shadows of the leaves seemed to nod. Yes, this is what I'd hoped to hear. Son, I will leave you again to find your place. Be safe. Be strong. It comes." Terry opened his mouth to say something, to shout for answers, but he felt himself pulled out of the dream and back into the wide world. Terry lay in bed and felt the warmth of the rising sun on his eyelids. Something about these dreams seemed familiar. He opened his eyes and a sunbeam came through the blinds on his window. He'd expected to be up already. He expected Ernest to at least have woken him up, but there he lay. He looked at the aged digital clock on the nightstand next to the bed. 6:03 a.m. He didn't, as a general rule, sleep late, especially when he knew he had plans to make. It was past time to get up, so he did. He considered putting a shirt and pants on, but no. Today, one way or the other, he was leaving. Weird face aside, what he'd said in the dream was true. He couldn't be what he needed to be on the farm. Alone, he got his armor and uniform on. By the time he was done, he had what he thought was a pretty good idea of what to do. He'd need a ride from Ernest, but he didn't think the old man would say no. He double-checked everything and went to start packing his meager belongings. Terry was somewhat alarmed to realize that it was all missing. He knew Dottie had cleaned his room, and maybe his normal clothes were in the wash, but his toiletries? He tore through the drawers in his medicine cabinet. Nothing. Had Dottie hid everything to make sure he didn't leave without saying goodbye? He rushed for the door and leaped past the 2 rickety wooden steps, and there she was, walking up from the house. Dottie looked up when she'd heard him, and Terry immediately noticed the brown leather saddlebag slung over her right shoulder. She called to him. "Good morning. I was hoping you'd be up." Her eyes were bright with unshed tears, and she held on to that smile of hers like a life raft. Terry could see it. He felt like his heart was suddenly in his throat, and the bottom of his stomach had fallen out. "Maybe I should have slipped out in the night," he thought. When she reached him, she dropped the bags to the ground at his feet and embraced him. He put his arms around her and buried his face in her hair. He knew she was staining his tabard, and he didn't care. He just stood there holding her and let the tears come. After a while, when he trusted himself to speak, he finally asked her what he was thinking. "Where's Ernest? Surely he'd be there for this." "He's on his way," she said, looking up at him. "We had a gift to give you, but it took longer than we thought. He's almost back, though." He strained his ears and could hear the sound of the truck somewhere out on the road. That was the thing about living out here. You knew when someone was coming. There was nothing else to hear. As Dottie stepped back from their hug, the truck came around behind the house with something in the back covered by a tarp. He looked at Dottie. "Do I get a hint?" he asked. "Nope." Dottie's smile looked like it would split her face in two. The mound looked too small to be a motorcycle. The truck came to a stop and Ernest practically leaped out of the driver's seat. He looked to Dottie. "You didn't tell him, did you?" "Of course not. I want to see the look on his face." Ernest ran around to the back of the truck and dropped the tailgate. Dottie ran around to help Ernest with the something, and Terry walked around to see it. They pulled the tarp off, and it was a scooter. It wasn't huge, but it was big enough to seat two. Honestly, it looked like someone had finished building a scooter with whatever was left around the workshop. The steering column was bare, and the pale yellow paint on the remaining body had lost its luster a long time ago. Dottie placed the saddlebags on both sides of the double seat. It had a single round headlight and tape around the steering column. "A scooter?" he said. "Yep," Ernest replied with a grin. Dottie continued for him. "We talked to your friend George out in Jackson, the one that tinkers all the time. Well, we knew this was going to come eventually. We had to make you a steed. A knight needs a steed. And it's got some kind of magical voodoo on it for gas mileage. George seemed pretty sure it wasn't going to blow up," Ernest said, giving the thing a doubtful look for a moment. "Anyway, it's yours if you'll have it." Terry walked over and started giving it a once-over. It was a piece of garbage. It should have been thrown back on the pile it came off of. To Terry, it was beautiful. He looked at his aunt and uncle. "I was just going to ask for a ride to town to buy something off Dwumbra." "Yeah, I know," Ernest said. "You'll need money to live off of, and I'm not letting you ride out of here on something that expensive you might wreck inside of a week." Something struck Terry then, something he hadn't thought of, or wanted to think of. "What about you two?" he asked. "Would you be okay with me gone?" Dottie answered. "One of your cousins on my side of the family's been bugging his parents about becoming a squire. We actually had our choice of folks wanting to come out here and train with us." "Really?" Terry said, starting to just sort of familiarize himself with the scooter. "Yep," Ernest said. "You gave me and Dottie pretty good reputations as trainers. The better you did, the better we looked." Ernest looked proud of himself. Heck, thought Terry, he probably should be for not being a knight. He might be the best there is, honestly. "I don't know what to say besides thank you, both of you," Terry said, and he looked down and tried to get the next part out. "I never thought I had parents growing up. You know how kids think. And for the short time I was at school, people really drove that home, but they were wrong. I was wrong. You two have been the best parents I could have asked for." After that, there were lots of hugs. They finally let him step away, trying not to drag things out. He double-checked the content of his bags, just to be on the safe side. It turned out all of his clothes were packed in there like he thought. Dottie had been busy. There was also a pair of goggles for him to wear on the road, which he pulled out. He climbed onto the seat and tried to get himself comfortable. He'd had training on scooters and motorcycles before, borrowed vehicles from Dwumbra's shop. It was required for knighthood and an absolute necessity for an errant apprentice. But this was different. He wanted to be comfortable with this. This was his scooter. "Wait," Dottie said before he could crank it. "It needs a name. He needs a name." Terry looked at the little scooter's gauges. He'd had a name in mind for a motorcycle. He'd always assumed he'd have a motorcycle, but that didn't matter. It was his, and it deserved the name. "Thunder," he said. "His name is Thunder." Dottie clasped her hands under her chin and smiled. "Do you know where you're going?" Ernest asked him, walking to stand over him. Terry thought about it. "South?" "Good," said Ernest. "There was a hurricane last month, and there should be mages down there on the coast helping with the relief efforts. You'll need a good mage to partner with on this." "Dad didn't have a mage," Terry said. "The hell he didn't. Don't worry about what your dad did and didn't do anyway. You do what you're going to do. Head down there and find yourself a heathen. An honest one. I will, he said, meeting his uncle's eyes. Ernest continued, and don't try to be your dad. Don't listen to them stories in the pulps. Don't listen to other knights. You be who you are. That's what's going to make you better than the rest of them. Terry was sort of shocked by that. Ernest had always encouraged his reading. He just nodded. And Terry, yes, Uncle Ernest? Don't tell anyone about the dreams, or the voices, or any of the other stuff. Maybe it's been nothing, but you're better off not letting anyone know. Terry looked past his uncle toward the sycamore tree next to his trailer. For a second, he thought he saw something in the branches, but a breeze was blowing. Maybe it was nothing. Yeah. I don't think I'm gonna let anyone know about that. I'll be careful. Ernest nodded and stepped back a few feet. Dottie stepped up next to his uncle and grabbed his arm. She looked like if this lasted any longer, she might start crying again. Heck, Ernest looked like he was about to come to pieces. Terry pulled the goggles back out of his coat pocket and put them on. He looked to his aunt and uncle and tried not to dwell on the nugget of fear he felt. Instead, he let the image of them standing there in front of his trailer soak into his mind. This was how he wanted to remember them. He smiled at them. I'll be back again. I promise. I love you. And with that, he cranked thunder and whipped around the house toward the road at speed. Ernest stood there with Dottie on his arm, staring after Terry. His brother's boy. His boy. He could never have his own, but he didn't need one. Terry was always enough. Do you think he'll be okay? Dottie asked him after a time. There's lots of competition out there. You know he'll be fine, he said. He thought on what the world out there had in store for the boy. He smiled to his wife. There's always room for one more Errant Apprentice in the world. Chapter 4. Pit Stop into Madness. Terry decided to start his journey to Biloxi on the back roads of Mississippi. It would help to distract him from the sadness of leaving home. The obvious route was to simply get on Highway 49 and drive south until you hit the Gulf, but that wasn't fun, and Terry wanted fun. Instead, he decided to take the Natchez Trace south and meander toward Port Gibson, trying to find his way. Not only would he be able to see the beauty of the state, but he might find people in need. It was around 8 a.m. when he realized that George, one of his two friends, and the one who'd constructed the scooter, hadn't actually filled the tank before Ernest had picked it up. Enchantment or not, he was going to need gas. He thought about having a long talk with George the next time he saw him, but the poor guy worked at Arby's. He probably couldn't afford to fill the gas tank. Somewhere between Rodney and Port Gibson, Terry left the Trace and managed to find a gas station. It looked like it had been built during the Great Depression. The siding was washed-out gray wood, and the two pumps out front were so old they had logos for a brand of gas that didn't even exist anymore. He rolled up to one and ran over a cable that made a ding-ding noise. The pump reset to 0 with a lot of clicking. As he pumped gas, his stomach grumbled. He'd left home without eating. He tried not to think about warm biscuits or waffles. He failed. Badly. He was going to have to pay inside, and a lot of these little hole-in-the-wall stores would have breakfast for the locals. He got impatient as he waited for the tiny tank to fill. It seemed to take longer than it should. He finished and trotted up to the storefront. The sign overhead just said, "Store," which was odd. Terry walked in and stopped to look around. All of the store's fixtures appeared to be made of plywood and chicken wire. The merchandise on the shelves spoke more of a grocery store than a convenience store. Canned goods everywhere with brands he'd never heard of. In the center of it was a series of square tables with chairs around them. That was good. It meant food was served here. In the back was the counter, and lining almost every flat surface and in the glass case were plastic jugs, like the kind you'd find pickles in. In these jugs were a myriad of animal parts floating in something pink and sad. As for the occupants, behind the counter was one of the oldest men Terry had ever seen. He was bald-headed and unshaven. His one good eye locked on Terry for a moment before drifting of its own accord. His other eye, Terry stared at it. It was glass. It seemed like an oversized marble, and there was something in it. If he had to guess, he would say the collective sins of mankind. He shivered. Pulled up to one of the tables was a mobility scooter holding a tiny, frail woman. She looked as if Jack Lynx had taken the mummy of Ramses II and made him into a meat sculpture. Her head lolled over to watch as Terry slowly made his way in. He raised a hand in greeting. "Hi, just filled up on pump, that one?" The old man's eye continued to wander as Terry walked up to the counter. He focused on Terry again for a moment. The nightmare clouds in the glass eye seemed to swirl. "That scooter out there? That's $8.55. Terry paid in a daze. He just couldn't stop staring at that eye. As the old man printed a receipt, he noticed Terry staring. "Something else I can do for you, son?" he said with a wild look in his good eye. "Oh," Terry snapped out of it. "Have you got any kind of breakfast food, biscuits or something?" He looked around the store for something to take his mind off the eye. "It's just I noticed you have all these, jugs." The old man looked around. He seemed slightly confused. Suddenly a voice like a crow screamed out and made Terry jump.
"You damn fool, he's looking for something to eat. Don't act like you don't know what he's saying."
The force of a voice came from the tiny remnant of a woman in the scooter. The old man leaned across the counter.
"Shut your mouth. You shut your dumb mouth right now. He said he wanted a car."
He looked up at Terry, who found himself frozen once again by the glass eye.
"You want a car, right?"
Terry's jaw worked for several seconds before he could get his mind to engage with the action. He had no idea how to play this. Finally, he heard himself speak. "Food, sir. I just want some food." The old man nodded at him, as if he finally understood. He reached over and unscrewed the top of one of the jars. The liquid in this one was, well, it wasn't really clear, just pink. Something unidentifiable floated in it, and the old man plunged a hand deep into the brine. He came up with something. Even seeing it in the open, Terry couldn't identify what it was. Just meat. The old man slapped it onto a newspaper sitting on the counter and wrapped it. He put a piece of butcher's tape over the top to hold it closed. Terry just stared at it as the man rang him up again. He didn't even see how much he paid for the mystery chunk. Taking it in both hands, Terry turned and walked to the door in a daze. As he passed the tiny woman, she spoke.
"You gotta be doing some sightseeing around here?"
Terry stopped and looked at her. The woman was more wrinkle than skin. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "That had been the plan on the way back north."
"You going to Rodney?"
she asked. Terry thought about it. Rodney was a ghost town in the area that he'd always wanted to visit. He'd heard there were goblins there. He really would like to see it if his new mage, whoever it turned out to be, was agreeable to it. He smiled weakly at the woman. "Yes, ma'am, if I get the chance." The old woman smiled at him and nodded. That made him feel better about the whole experience, so he continued to the door. Right before he could reach a moist and greasy hand to the door handle, her voice rang out, stopping him in his tracks.
"Don't go to Rodney at night."
Terry didn't move anything but his head. It slowly swiveled around to face the old woman, his eyes wide and his face pale. He heard himself whisper, "Why?" His mind was filled with mind-eaters and the gaping maw of a Shoggoth. She looked at him as if he were the stupidest thing in the wide world before she replied,
"It's dark. You can't see nothing."
The old man even seemed to snap out of it and stare at Terry. Terry smacked his forehead into the door, partly out of relief, partly to make sure this entire store wasn't a dream. "Yes, of course, thank you, good day." With that, he rushed outside and found the scooter, Thunder, parked by the front door. He sat on it and quickly devoured the mystery object wrapped in the newspaper before he even realized he'd done it. He looked at the soaked page and shivered. Terry was going to regret that. He knew it. He looked at the scooter's gauges and something dawned on him. Did I move the scooter before I came in? He wondered. He shook his head. He must have. He started up Thunder and sped off, trying to leave the tiny shop behind him. The next 2 hours Terry would refer to for the rest of his life as the Pooh Gauntlet, as he became familiar with every gas station bathroom and several bushes between Port Gibson and Biloxi. Chapter 5. Mystic Lipstick. After the worst 2 hours of his short life, Terry finally entered Biloxi. He'd gotten off the back roads as soon as he could and gotten on Highway 49. Straight shot to the coast and more bathrooms. He steered Thunder into a parking spot right along the beach on Highway 90 and took his goggles off and looked out at the gray waters of the Gulf of Mexico. I haven't been down here since I was a kid, you know, he said. He shook his head. Barely away from home and I'm already talking to my scooter. He grinned. You don't mind, though, do you? He patted the scooter on the headlight. You did great, Thunder. Thank you. Normally, there would be tourists crawling all over the beach, but not now. Ernest had said there had been a hurricane the previous month, and now that Terry wasn't paying attention to the road, he could see the signs. Buildings were still damaged or destroyed. Worse, right along the beach. He could see dwarves working diligently on the other side of the road, trying to get Biloxi back into some kind of working shape. That was odd. Ernest also said there should be mages down here, and so far Terry hadn't seen any. Of course, they might be somewhere working on infrastructure. He was going to have to take a look around, or he would in a few minutes. The sounds and motions of his stomach decided they weren't done after all. He looked around frantically and saw a row of Crapper Johns set up for the construction crew. They looked unoccupied. Wait here, he said to Thunder, and don't get stolen. 20 minutes later, Terry emerged feeling relieved and slightly embarrassed. A passing dwarf looked at him oddly. Terry shrugged. Gas station food, he said by way of an explanation. The dwarf nodded. You like that sort of thing? Not anymore, I don't. Terry started to walk away when he remembered an idea he'd had. He spun back around and trotted up beside the dwarf. The dwarf had a neatly trimmed gray beard and seemed to be dressed in a denim shirt. It was hard to tell with all the hair. Probably a foreman. Sir, can I bother you for a second? He said. The dwarf looked him up and down as they walked. You looking for work? I might could find something for you to do. No, sir. I'm looking for any mages that might be around. The dwarf threw his head back and laughed, which surprised Terry. Kid, I'm 21, sir. Kid, the dwarf continued, there's only one mage around here right now that isn't high as balls on the mana flux from the storm. She's down the road a little ways helping out with relief. Look for them all. Thank you, sir. Terry gave him a big smile. Thought he always said his smiles were disarming. The name's Gunt, kid. I'll warn you. That mage is ornery. Thanks? Terry said as he walked on down the street. The Edgewater was a nice mall from the little Terry could remember of it from his childhood. Was being the operative word. It was in pretty bad shape with the windows blown out and obvious water damage everywhere. Construction was still ongoing and the parking lot had a dozen or so tents and awnings set up with lines of people everywhere. They were leaving with food and blankets mostly. Terry's heart went out to them. He also felt warmth at seeing people helping others. Humans and dwarves were working together. Heck, it looked like there were 2 or 3 elves here, too. Maybe, he thought, if I don't find this mage, I should volunteer for a few days. He liked that idea, but he decided to try and do what he'd come down here for first. He started walking the parking lot and tried to make it clear he didn't need any help. He also tried his best not to look like a creep as he searched. He looked at faces and clothes and realized quickly that he had no idea how to identify a mage out of a crowd. He was going to have to ask for help. He picked someone at random. There seemed to be a boy with his head shaved, stacking blankets with his back turned. He'd do. Terry approached cautiously. "Excuse me, sir." The boy, girl, spun to face him. Terry stopped dead in his tracks. Even without hair, she was stunning. Bright blue eyes, strange color-changing lipstick on a pair of smirking lips. She was wearing a strange one-piece with jeans over it and a belt with a massive gold belt buckle with a face on it. She was... Terry shook his head to try and clear it and hoped to God she didn't notice he was staring so badly. Dolores wasn't sure what she was expecting when someone called her sir. It wasn't unheard of, and it wasn't that bad. She wasn't really angry. She had just reached a level of annoyance that no human had probably ever reached in their life. She spun on the voice, hands on her hips, ready with a smirk and a snarky comment, and swallowed whatever she was about to say. The boy, man, whatever, was handsome. She almost thought he was using a glamour spell with his mess of jet black hair and his jaw and his piercing eyes and his armor. His stupid armor and a white and red tabard under a duster. He was a stupid knight. "Ma'am," she settled on as a reply. She hung on to her annoyance desperately and tried not to ogle the poor guy. He held up his hands and had the decency to look embarrassed. "Ma'am, I am so sorry. I wasn't paying attention." He bowed to her. He actually bowed to her. He's new, she thought, painfully new to this. "It's fine," she said. "I don't know if you noticed, but we're kind of busy here." At that, she turned back around and started folding and stacking blankets. "I understand, ma'am." He still sounded embarrassed. "Good. I was wondering if you'd heard anything about a mage helping out around here?" She glanced over her shoulder at him. Was he serious? "I want you to think about how your day is going after what just happened and make a wild guess about where she is." "It's you," he said, slapping his forehead. Very satisfying. He was quick on the uptake. "Of course it's you. I'm so sorry, ma'am. My name's Terry Langle, and I'm looking for someone to partner with." Dolores nearly spit out a drink that she wasn't drinking. What a noob. "You are in luck, Mr. Knight." "My name's Terry," he said, and she ignored him. "Biloxi, Gulfport, and Pass Christian are stuffed to the gills with mages. All you have to do is scoop the stoners up in a wheelbarrow, and you've got one." "About that," he said, walking up beside her and actually helping to fold blankets. "Why is that? You're the second person to talk about them like they're addicts." Dolores sighed. She slapped her current blanket down on the stack and faced him, fists on hips. "The hurricane, Mr. Knight. The low-pressure front pushes all the mana in the area ahead of it." She demonstrated using her fist to push her palm. "It hit and weakened, and the storm died not far inland. But the mana it pushed with it stayed." She grabbed another blanket and tried not to look at him too long. He was just so... interested? Attentive? Handsome? "Stop it," she thought. "So all these mages showed up to try and help turn or lessen the storm," she continued. "They opened themselves up to try their spells, and the huge mana surge got them completely stoned. Now that there's a standing mana field for another few weeks, they're all just sitting around being useless." "But not you?" he asked. He was still folding blankets with her. "It takes either an extremely powerful mage or an extremely weak one to resist the currents, Mr. Knight," she said. "And which are you, ma'am?" "Please stop calling me ma'am," she said. "I'm 20. "I don't know what else to call you." She sighed again. She hadn't intended to give him her name. "Dolores," she said. "Stupid name," she mumbled to herself. Possibly the most horrible sound she'd ever heard came from his stomach just then. If a bear fought a wookalar, it would sound something like that. He looked up in alarm and spotted the closest line of Crapper Johns. He looked at her with urgency in his eyes. "I'm not done, Dolores. I'll be back ASAP. I still want to team up. Dolores raised her hand with an objection ready, but he was off like a shot. She would not just wait around for him. She wouldn't. She had no intention of teaming up with some new untrained knight and end up doing all the work. Besides, the nice guy thing was probably a front. It always seemed to be. She frowned at that and grabbed an armload of blankets to fold. Dolores finished her work sometime later and checked her phone for the time. Night or not, the poor guy had been in that thing for a while. Maybe she should check on him. He honestly didn't seem that bad. He had apologized for the misgendering thing. She had to have a healing spell or something in her notebook. Besides, she was going to send him on his way right after. Someone ran by her toward the still-standing part of the mall. So did a woman with her kids. Then more people. Then everyone seemed to be running. She turned around, and across the highway she saw what everyone was running from. Coming up out of the gulf, there was what looked like a giant snake. She staggered back against the table, knocking it and her blankets over. Could she do something about this? With her protection spell? Counter spells? Not likely. She looked around as humans and dwarves scattered, some into the mall, some off the property. She looked to the Crapper Johns and made a run for it. She started knocking on the doors of each one and shouting, "Mr. Knight! Oh, Mr. Knight, please tell me you're still in there." A muffled voice came from the fourth door. Yes. I'm glad you're excited to talk about my proposal, but I'm... Nope, not now. Big, bad, big bad. Giant snake thing, please, help. Silence for a moment. Okay, he finally said. I want you to describe it to me while I finish up. She looked at the thing as it undulated across the sand toward the road. Long, light green, looks like a snake. The head? He asked. Kind of like a dragon with spikes at the cheeks, red eyes. Does that help? It does, actually. Thank you. He sounded cheerful. How could he sound cheerful about this? In a toilet. Is it doing anything in particular, or is it just kind of meandering? He asked. As the thing crossed the road, Dolores saw that its body was extremely long and was still partially submerged. It reached the end of the parking lot, opened its mouth, and began to blast steaming water at the remains of the mall entrance. It's blasting the mall with water from its mouth. Okay, Terry said from behind the door. It sounds like we're dealing with a gargoyle, or water-breathing sea serpent, looking for a nest to flood. Have you seen one before? No! I'm from Bay St. Louis, but I've never really heard of one. She considered opening the door and snatching the man out of the booth, but thought better of it for both their sakes. The door opened just then, and he stood there. Somehow he managed to look sort of majestic, even standing in the doorway of a crapper. He looked at her, and then at the monster. Do you need backup? There's a knight north of here, I've heard, she asked. Admittedly, she'd heard the guy was an ass, but still, 2 knights had a better chance against whatever this thing was. He stepped down past her and reached into his coat, smiling. He pulled a sword out of an inside pocket. Coat must be enchanted, she thought. He looked back at her. No, but be ready to evacuate the mall while it's distracted if this goes south. She blinked. With that, he launched himself at a dead run at the beast. You're going to get yourself killed, you idiot! She yelled after him. She thought and quietly recited the words for one of the only spells she could think of and gestured to him. The air around him shimmered for a second, and he continued his run. He was surprisingly fast for being in a full set of plate armor. The monster heard his steps and stopped its blast of water. It turned to him, and she knew he was a dead man. When he was close to the thing, he leaped. Not jumped, but leaped. It was the only word she could think of to describe it. Everything seemed to move in slow motion as she watched. He raised the sword over his head, and the blade seemed to come alive with the light of the sun. She could feel the mana in the area rush toward that blade and feed its glow. The monster blasted Terry with a superheated jet of water as steam flooded out the sides of its mouth. The water seemed to part around Terry as he flew closer, and the look on the monster's face could only be called shocked. She grinned. Her spell had worked. Terry swung his sword down at an angle instead of at the monster's head, and the blade seemed to reach out for it. It stretched. It was a blinding arc for a moment. The monster was so surprised it didn't notice its head slide off its neck for a full minute. Terry landed on his feet on the other side of the monster. He used his sword, now back to being normal metal again, to steady himself. Dolores gasped. She'd met knights. She'd heard some of the propaganda the church and the order put out. None of it was even close to this. Before she realized what she was doing, she ran toward him. This strange young man who turned to look at her with a sheepish grin on his face, almost like he was embarrassed to have done something like this in front of someone. People and dwarves flooded out of the mall and looked on in awe at the newly bisected monster and the man who'd done the deed. Before they or she could get to him, though, there was a dwarf suddenly beside him. That was Gunt, wasn't it? When she got there, she could hear part of what he was saying. "Saved hundreds, and most of them my crew!" He was gesticulating wildly. "Heck, the mayor will probably be here soon. If you need anything, and I mean anything, I'll be more than happy to provide it." Terry looked down at the old dwarf. "Pants," he said. "I need new pants." Gunt looked confused, and all Dolores could do as the crowd reached them was laugh. Dolores sat in a lawn chair outside of a FEMA trailer a block from the beach. Gunt had brought Terry here after defeating the gargoyle, and a dwarf had brought a pair of pants and thrown them in the door. She wasn't really sure what she was doing there. She'd sort of followed along behind them, with Terry looking over her shoulder at her every now and again, and here she was. She felt like an idiot. She still wasn't going to team up with him. It sounded like a kid's game when he said it. So why was she here? She could hear laughter from Gunt every now and again. Terry didn't seem to have an ego to bruise. He'd been embarrassed, but not ashamed by whatever he'd done to his pants. And he'd just sort of run at that monster. Who does that? Really? She thought. And as much as she hated to admit it, there was just something likable about the guy. He seemed earnest? Honest? Who knows? She decided she'd at least hear his offer out. She owed him that much for what he'd done. But did she really? The door to the trailer opened and she looked up. Terry walked down the 3 steps looking over his shoulder. Gunt stood in the doorway, and she heard the tail end of their conversation. "You're sure you won't stay to meet the mayor?" "Nah," said Terry. "I figure there's somewhere else around that needs me. If something else comes up, though, just contact me through the order." "And all you needed was the enchanted bismuth." "Well, there were the pants. Thank you for that, by the way." Gunt shook his head. "You saved a town, and you're thanking me. Kid, you are something else. Now, get out of here and go be a hero." They shook hands, and Gunt closed the door. Terry turned to walk away and started. He had just noticed her there, it seems. She tried a smile. "Hi." "Oh, hi! I'm really glad to see you." He grinned, and her smile felt a little more genuine. She stood, and they faced each other. There was an awkward moment where neither of them spoke. Dolores racked her brain trying to think of what to say, and all she got was modem noises. Finally, Terry spoke. Would you walk with me back to my ride for a minute?" She shrugged. "Sure, why not?" Terry started walking, so she fell in beside him and put her hands in her pockets. "So," he started, "I noticed you had metal wristbands on one arm and gauze on the other. Is that like a punk thing?" "Spell components. Keeps me from needing a wand." He nodded. "That was you that cast the protection spell?" She looked at him. raising an eyebrow. He'd noticed. You ran toward a monster full tilt with no obvious plan. What else was I supposed to do? He smiled again. You have really good instincts, Dolores. She looked away at the rubble of a nearby building, trying to will herself not to blush. This was ridiculous. First time I've heard that, she said. Look, I'm not very good at this whole mage thing, okay? I'm one of the weak ones. I mostly know counter spells and a few COPs. You want somebody with some experience. He was staring at her, and it was a bit unnerving. No, I don't, he said. What? I don't want someone with experience. I want someone with good instincts. I want someone who will act in a tough spot. I want someone who's willing to try. She gaped at him. I think that's you, Dolores. She continued to gape at him. How was this guy real? You're new at this, aren't you? She asked. Officially? Yeah, kinda, like this morning. I just graduated to Errant Apprentice. She shook her head. They reached Highway 90 and headed east. She started looking out for a motorcycle. She hoped it hadn't been washed out by the gargoyle. All that seemed to be left was a garbage pile of a scooter. Where's your bike at? He smiled, pointing at the little death trap. There he is. He frowned. It's weird. This isn't where I parked him. They stopped at the thing, and Dolores only shook her head at it. A two-seater scooter. Lovely. She looked at him. Well, you may as well make your pitch. That's why we're both here, isn't it? My pitch? He seemed a little confused. You know, she said. The whole fortune and glory spiel where you tell me about how we're going to go down in history as the greatest knight and mage ever seen. Then you're going to shortchange me on the profit sharing. Terry watched her for an uncomfortably long time. Then he sat sideways on the scooter to face her. He put his elbows on his knees and clasped his hands. He reminded her of a youth pastor all of a sudden. He looked up at her with an expression that was so open she took a step back. This kind of honesty in people frightened her. Do you know why I'm doing this? Should I? She asked. Dolores, when I was growing up, my aunt and uncle trained me to be a knight. It was what my father did before me. But that's not why I do this. I could have said no at any point and gone back to school. Where the hell was he going with this? I've known something since I was old enough to pay attention. There's evil in the world. There are bullies and monsters and things that are just plain unjust. I've seen people get the snot kicked out of them for no other reason than they were there and they were different. I've seen authority figures stand by while it happened. She shrugged. It's life, isn't it? It doesn't have to be. People need help out here. They need protection. They need encouragement. Everyone out here can be better. They just haven't seen it yet. This man simply cannot be real, she thought again. You believe that? Like, actually really believe that? The day I truly dedicated myself to becoming a knight was the day I got expelled from school for beating up the principal for letting my friends get bullied, because it built character. Dolores knelt in front of him and found herself grinning. How old were you, Terry? I don't know, 10, maybe 9. You beat up a grown man at 10? He straightened up and started scratching the back of his head. He gave her a sheepish grin. Or 9, I was young at the time, I don't really remember. She laughed. Good Lord, there was a hero sitting there in front of her. Like a real one. Bravery and compassion without any thought of the consequences to himself. She frowned. He was gonna get himself killed out here in the real world. She hadn't meant to make a decision. Not this one, at least. But she couldn't let someone murder a puppy of a knight in training either. She made a choice. How much? She sighed. Huh? The profit split, dummy. She put on her most put-upon expression. He said, looking to the sky. I don't know much about how this works yet, and I kinda suck at math. The whole expulsion thing, you know. 50-50 is probably the easiest way to split it. Does that sound right? Her jaw nearly hit the pavement. What? Well, I don't know that it would be fair to give you more. She put a hand on his knee. She realized she'd put a hand on his knee and immediately snatched it back like she'd been burned. She looked up into that big, dopey face instead. Let's just say I would have been willing to settle for a bit less. Oh, he said, looking surprised. Well, that wouldn't have been fair either. Dolores couldn't believe she was doing this. Can you please give me a ride to my apartment so I can get my things? If this pile of crap of yours actually runs. He smiled at her. I promise you, thunder runs.